Nobody expected that the quiet man in work boots digging by the roadside would turn an entire neighborhood's world upside down. But when Clarissa Vanderbilt called the police on Elijah Brooks that Monday morning, she had no idea she was about to confront a history that would strip away everything she thought she owned. The morning air in Savannah's suburbs carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and fresh-cut grass, but Clarissa Vanderbilt barely noticed as she sipped her coffee from bone china on her wraparound porch. She was reviewing the quarterly Homeowners Association reports when movement caught her eye through the lace curtains. A black man in faded denim overalls was methodically digging along the walkway of the vacant lot next to her pristine Georgian colonial. No company logo, no permit posted, no explanation. Just steady, practiced movements of a shovel breaking earth. Clarissa set down her cup with a sharp clink against the saucer. In the 18 years she'd lived in Magnolia Park, the crown jewel of Savannah's elite residential developments, she'd never seen unauthorized work. The Homeowners Association she chaired had strict protocols. Every contractor, every landscaper, every delivery driver required prior approval and proper identification. The sound of metal striking soil continued, rhythmic and unhurried. She smoothed her silk blouse and walked across her manicured lawn, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. The morning dew had already evaporated, leaving the grass crisp under her feet. As she approached, she noticed the man's technique, precise, efficient, like someone who'd spent decades working the earth. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "This is private property. You can't just dig here without authorization." The man straightened slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. But honest labor in the wrong place, she reminded herself. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl, "I have every right to be here." Clarissa felt her jaw tighten, the audacity, the complete disregard for property rights and community standards. "This entire development belongs to Magnolia Park Homeowners Association. I'm the chairman of the board, and I'm telling you—" "I know who you are, Mrs. Vanderbilt," he interrupted gently. "I'm Elijah Brooks. This is my land now." The words hung in the humid air like a challenge. Clarissa laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "Impossible. Whitehurst Properties developed this entire neighborhood. Every lot was sold years ago through proper channels." Elijah reached into his back pocket and pulled out a leather document holder, worn smooth from handling. "Maybe you should take a look at this." He handed her the papers with dirt-stained fingers. The deed was recent, dated just 3 weeks ago. Purchase price, $1.3 million. Buyer, Elijah D. Brooks. The legal description matched the vacant lot exactly. Clarissa stared at the documents, her mind racing. "This can't be right. There must be some mistake. I need to call—" "Go ahead," Elijah said, returning to his digging. "Call whoever you need to call." She was already pulling out her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity in Magnolia Park. There's an unidentified man conducting unauthorized excavation on private property." She rattled off her address, glancing back at Elijah, who continued working as if he hadn't heard every word. 20 minutes later, Sergeant Manson's patrol car pulled into the development, its presence immediately drawing curious neighbors to their windows. Clarissa watched from her front steps as the officer approached Elijah, who had set his shovel aside and was waiting calmly. "Sir, we received a complaint about unauthorized digging," Sergeant Manson said, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Can you tell me what you're doing here?" "Working on my property, officer." Elijah handed over the same documents he'd shown Clarissa. Sergeant Manson studied the papers, his expression growing more serious as he read. "These look legitimate, sir. Mrs. Vanderbilt, the deed appears to be in order." Clarissa marched over, her heels striking the pavement like gunshots. "That's impossible. Whitehurst Properties owns all undeveloped land in this neighborhood. They would never sell to—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. "To someone like me?" Elijah asked quietly. The question landed like a physical blow. Clarissa felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's not what I meant. I meant they follow very specific procedures for sales in this development." "They did," Elijah said. "I met all their requirements, paid in full, cash offer, no financing contingencies. They were quite happy to do business with me." Sergeant Manson handed the documents back to Elijah. Everything appears to be in order here. Mr. Brooks, if you need anything else, you know how to reach us. He tipped his hat to Clarissa. Ma'am. As the patrol car disappeared down the tree-lined street, Clarissa stood alone with Elijah in the growing heat of the day. The sound of her neighbors' whispered conversations drifted from porches and partially open doors. "What are you planning to build?" she asked finally. Elijah picked up his shovel. "Something that should have been here a long time ago." That night, Clarissa couldn't sleep. She sat in her home office, surrounded by mahogany bookcases and oil paintings of ancestors she'd never met, researching property records and development history. The Magnolia Park files were extensive: surveys, environmental reports, zoning approvals dating back to the original land acquisition. But the deeper she dug into public records, the more questions arose. The original tract had been farmland, nearly 300 acres owned by a single family, the Brookses. They'd worked the land for 3 generations, growing cotton and later switching to soybeans and corn. Solid, productive farming that had sustained them through the Depression and beyond. Then came 1923. The records from that year were sparse, but Clarissa found newspaper clippings in the digital archives of the Savannah Morning News. A fire had swept through the Brooks farmhouse in October. Walter Brooks, the patriarch, had been accused of insurance fraud, a charge that was never proven but had resulted in his arrest. While he sat in jail awaiting trial, the county had seized the property for unpaid taxes that had supposedly accumulated during his incarceration. Walter Brooks had died in jail 3 weeks before his trial date. Heart attack, the coroner ruled. His widow and children were evicted, the land sold at auction to settle the alleged debt. The winning bidder had been Whitehurst Properties' predecessor company. Clarissa stared at the screen, the cursor blinking against the old newspaper text. The timing was too convenient, the accusations too convenient, the death too convenient. Even in 1923, the circumstances would have raised eyebrows. In 2025, they looked like highway robbery dressed up in legal paperwork. She cross-referenced birth records, death certificates, family genealogies. Elijah's grandfather had been Walter Brooks's youngest son, barely 15 when his family lost everything. He'd moved north, working factory jobs in Detroit, never speaking much about the Georgia farm that had slipped away in a haze of false accusations and legal manipulation. But families remember. Even when they try to forget, they remember. The next morning, Clarissa was waiting by her window when Elijah arrived. He carried a leather satchel along with his tools, and she watched him spread papers on the tailgate of his pickup truck before beginning work. She walked over, trying to project the same authority she'd shown the day before, but her voice sounded smaller somehow. "We need to talk." Elijah looked up from his surveying. "I was wondering when you'd ask." "I know who you are," she said. "I know about your grandfather." "Then you know why I'm here." Clarissa felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of certainty she'd carried for decades. The records from 1923? They don't look right. "No," Elijah agreed. "They don't." He set down his measuring tape and faced her fully. In the morning light, she could see her own reflection in his eyes, smaller than she'd imagined herself, less sure of her ground. "Walter Brooks was an honest man," Elijah said. "Paid his taxes on time, kept meticulous records, treated his workers fairly. The fire started in the kitchen, an accident, but accident or not, he'd insured the house properly. When he went to collect, they accused him of arson, but the trial never happened. Funny how a healthy 40-year-old man has a heart attack in jail just before he can defend himself in court." Clarissa wrapped her arms around herself despite the warming day. "How do you know all this?" "Because my grandfather kept every document, every receipt, every tax payment, every letter from the insurance company. He passed them to my father, who passed them to me, along with the promise that someday someone in our family would come home. But the statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraudulent conveyance of property through criminal conspiracy," Elijah said. "I've got lawyers too, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Good ones. They've been working on this case for 3 years. That afternoon, Clarissa's phone rang constantly. Neighbors wanting to know what was happening, board members demanding explanations, her own attorney calling with increasingly grave updates. "Clarissa," said Richard Henley, her lawyer for 15 years, "we need to meet. Today." They sat in his downtown office overlooking the Savannah River as he spread documents across his conference table like tarot cards predicting disaster. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "The Brooks family has a legitimate claim not just to that one lot, but to significant portions of the original development. If their legal theory holds up in court, and it might, Whitehurst Properties could lose the right to sell any of the remaining parcels." "But my house. Your deed is probably safe. You bought in good faith from the listed owner. But Mr. Brooks has already filed easement claims for the old farm roads that used to run through the property. Some of those rights-of-way cut right through existing backyards." Clarissa felt the room spin slightly. "Including mine?" Richard nodded grimly. "Including yours." That evening, she found Elijah still working as the sun set, installing what looked like a survey marker. The hole he'd been digging was precisely measured, the dirt piled neatly to one side. "You could have told me," she said. "Would you have listened?" The question hit her like cold water. She thought about her phone call to 911, her assumption that he didn't belong, her certainty that the papers were fake. "Probably not," she admitted. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this place," Elijah said, smoothing the earth around the marker. "About the peach orchard that grew over there, the creek that ran behind where your house sits now. He'd describe every acre like he was still walking through it." "What are you going to do? With the land, I mean?" Elijah was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Finally, he looked up at her house, at the gardens she'd spent years perfecting, the renovations that had taken decades to complete. "What should have been done a long time ago," he said. "Make it right." The legal battle moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 months, Elijah had acquired 3 more parcels in Magnolia Park, including the lot directly behind Clarissa's house. Whitehurst Properties, facing a federal investigation into their historical land acquisitions, began settling claims quickly and quietly. Clarissa's easement hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. She sat in the courthouse, watching Elijah present his case with calm precision, backed by historical surveys, family documents, and testimony from elderly residents who remembered the original farm. The judge ruled in his favor. The old farm road, now buried under landscaping and swimming pools, legally belonged to the Brooks Family Trust. But when Clarissa arrived home that afternoon, expecting to find construction equipment and surveying stakes, she found something else entirely. Elijah was planting trees, not the invasive ornamental species that dotted most of the development, but native Georgia oaks and pecans, muscadine vines, and wild azaleas, plants that belonged to this soil that had grown here before anyone thought to call it Magnolia Park. "I thought you were going to build a road," she said. "I could," he replied, his hands black with earth, "but roads can be moved. Trust is harder to rebuild." He showed her the plans he'd drawn up, a walking path that would wind through the backyards, connecting the development to the old creek that still ran behind the tree line. Benches where neighbors could sit and talk. A small pavilion where the original farmhouse had stood. "A memorial?" Clarissa asked. "A reminder," Elijah corrected, "that this place has always belonged to the people who loved it enough to stay." The transformation of Magnolia Park became front-page news across Georgia. Civil rights lawyers hailed it as a victory for historical justice. Property rights advocates warned of dangerous precedent. Real estate developers quietly began reviewing their own historical acquisitions, worried about what other long-buried claims might surface. But in the neighborhood itself, something quieter was happening. Children who had never met began playing together on the new walking paths. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades started sharing stories across the garden spaces Elijah had created. The homeowners association meetings, once dominated by complaints about lawn height and fence materials, began focusing on community gardens and historical preservation. Clarissa found herself walking the paths most evenings, often encountering other residents doing the same. They would nod, exchange pleasantries about the weather or the progress of the new plantings, and gradually those conversations grew longer. "I never knew about the Brooks family," said Margaret Chen, who lived 3 houses down. "My kids are learning about it in school now, how the land was taken, what happened to Walter Brooks. It's not the kind of history they taught us growing up." "None of us knew," Clarissa replied. "That was probably the point." The dedication ceremony for the Walter Brooks Memorial Garden took place on a humid Saturday in June. Local officials attended, along with historians, community leaders, and several members of the Brooks family who had traveled from Detroit and Chicago and Atlanta to see the land their ancestors had lost finally reclaimed. Elijah spoke without notes, his voice carrying across the crowd gathered where the old farmhouse had once stood. "My great-grandfather cleared this land by hand," he said. "My grandfather learned to read sitting under the oak tree that used to grow right here. They planted crops in soil they loved, raised children in a house they built themselves, and believed that hard work and honest dealing would be enough to keep what was theirs." He paused, looking out over faces that included both longtime neighbors and relatives who were seeing the land for the first time. They were wrong about that last part, but they were right about the love, and they were right about the work. This garden isn't just for them. It's for everyone who's ever felt like their roots didn't matter, like their history could be erased, like their place in the world could be taken away with a signature on the wrong piece of paper. The applause was long and heartfelt, but Clarissa found herself thinking about quieter moments. Elijah working alone in the early morning light, his hands shaping the land with the same care his ancestors had shown a century before. After the crowd dispersed and the official speeches ended, she found him sitting on one of the memorial benches, holding something small in his palm. "What's that?" she asked. He opened his hand to reveal a tarnished button, green with age. "From my great-grandfather's work shirt. Found it this morning when I was checking the irrigation lines." Clarissa sat beside him on the bench. The evening air smelled of honeysuckle and rain, and fireflies were beginning to blink among the newly planted trees. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "For what?" "For assuming you didn't belong here. For calling the police before I asked questions. For believing that ownership was about paperwork instead of—" She gestured toward the garden around them. "Instead of this." Elijah closed his fingers around the button. "You weren't the first person to make those assumptions about me. Probably won't be the last. But I should have been better." "Should have, could have, would have," he said gently. "What matters is what we do next." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the development. Lights began coming on in houses that had once felt like separate kingdoms, now connected by winding paths and shared stories. "What will you do now?" Clarissa asked. "With the rest of the land?" "Keep planting," Elijah said. "Keep building. Keep reminding people that this place has always been about more than just the houses sitting on top of it." A year later, the Magnolia Park Community Garden had become a model for historical reconciliation and neighborhood integration. Visitors came from across the Southeast to see how a development built on stolen land had transformed itself into something approaching justice. But Clarissa's favorite moments weren't the official tours or the academic conferences. They were the Saturday mornings when she would find Elijah teaching local children how to identify native plants, their small hands learning to distinguish between the invasive species that had taken over and the original flora that belonged to this soil. "How do you know which ones are supposed to be here?" asked Emma, a 7-year-old from down the street. "Same way you know where you belong," Elijah replied, kneeling beside her in the dirt. "You listen to the land, and you pay attention to who was here first." The child nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense, and continued pulling weeds from around a young oak tree. Clarissa kept walking, but she carried that exchange with her, the simplicity of belonging, the responsibility of recognition, the possibility of making amends. In her home office, she had replaced one of her ancestor portraits with a framed photograph of the original Brooks farmhouse found in the County Historical Society archives. Walter Brooks stood on the front porch with his family, his hand resting on a wooden fence post, his expression serious but not unkind. He looked, she thought, like a man who understood the weight of ownership, not just the legal right to exclude others, but the moral obligation to tend and protect and pass on something better than what you'd inherited. She thought about that photograph often, especially when she walked the memorial paths in the evening, past the homes of neighbors who had become friends, through gardens that bloomed with native species and stories that had finally been allowed to take root. Sometimes she would encounter Elijah still working, still planting, still shaping the land with the same patient care his family had shown generations before. They would exchange greetings, perhaps share news about community projects or upcoming events, and then continue on their separate ways through the connected landscape they had all learned to call home. The last time she saw him, he was installing a small plaque near the Memorial Gardens entrance. It read, "In memory of Walter Brooks and all who were displaced, in hope that we remember not only what was lost but what can still be found." Below that, in smaller text, "The land remembers. So should we." Clarissa stood reading those words as the sun set behind the trees Elijah had planted, casting long shadows across the paths they had all learned to walk together. She thought about phone calls that should never have been made, assumptions that should never have been accepted, and second chances that should never be taken for granted. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing as they played in the community garden, their voices mixing with the evening songs of birds that had returned to nest in native trees. The sound carried across lawns and through open windows, connecting houses that had once stood in isolation, weaving together stories that had been kept apart for far too long. The land remembered. And finally, so did they. Remember this story when you're tempted to assume someone doesn't belong. Talent, dignity, and rightful place aren't always visible at first glance, but they're always worth discovering before it's too late.